What if, on the morning of April 26, 1986, someone at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant had simply said, "No, guys, let's not press that button. I'm going to go get some coffee." Imagine, no explosion, no radioactive chaos, no stories about fireflies in the sky that were actually deadly particles. Instead, it's a normal working day. The engineers are drinking their tea with dried milk, and Gorbachev is probably not scratching the back of his head thinking about how to explain the world's next Soviet success. The irony is that we all know what happened in reality. Not only the reactor exploded, but also the myths about the infallibility of the system. But what if this had not happened? What if Chernobyl had remained just the name of the city and not a synonym for disaster? This topic is not just a game of what if. It touches because we all live in the world that was shaped by that explosion. Some people remember how their grandmother used to hide her vegetables from the radiation rain. Others still joke that our politicians are mutants from the exclusion zone. Well, doesn't it sound like it? But imagine a world where this did not happen, where the Soviet Union might have survived longer, nuclear energy would have become our best friend, and Pripyat would still be a city with living streets, not a horror movie set. Interesting? You bet you are. Because we're about to dive into an alternative history where one small change, say a sober engineer or a working detector, turns everything upside down. And believe me, it will be harder to tear yourself away from this story than from the HBO series about Chernobyl. Only here there are no pretentious monologues and a touch of humor. So pour yourself some coffee, or vodka if you're in the mood for the good old USSR, and let's go reflect on how life would have been if Chernobyl hadn't exploded. Why is this worth your attention? Because it's not just a fantasy, it's a look at how one event can reshape entire countries, technologies, and even our habits. We will go through all the what-ifs, from the fate of the Soviet Union to whether we would still be wearing flared pants if the economy hadn't hiccuped after the crash. And yes, there will be a bit of irony, for example, over Gorbachev, who, without Chernobyl, might still be reading his speeches from a piece of paper, rather than being remembered as the one who ruined everything. Are you ready? Then hold on, because what follows is a story you won't be able to put down, even if you want to check if your cacti are glowing from radiation. Translated with DeepL.com free version. So, April 26, 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. In the real world, everything went wrong at that moment. The fourth reactor exploded, leaving behind a cloud of radiation and headaches for an entire generation. But in our alternate history, someone say, an engineer named Vasily with a hangover, but a keen sense of responsibility, noticed that testing the reactor looked like a bad idea. "Forget it," he says. "We'll test it tomorrow when we have more coffee." And so the button is not pressed, there is no explosion, and Chernobyl is quietly working, supplying electricity to the grid. What happens next? The first thing that changes is the fate of the Soviet Union. In reality, Chernobyl was one of the nails in the coffin of the USSR. The disaster exposed the problems of the system, from corruption to irresponsibility. Without it, Gorbachev might have had more time to restructure the system. Imagine, no huge liquidation costs, no panic among the population, no international shame. The economy stays afloat for longer, and party bosses are in no hurry to blame each other for everything is lost. Let's say the USSR collapses not in 1991, but for example in 1995 or even later. Irony? Of course. Imagine Gorbachev proudly waving his arms on the podium, talking about a bright future, while somewhere in the Kremlin they are quietly rewriting plans for the next 5-year plan. But would this have saved the Union forever? Doubtful. There were already too many cracks, but a postponement would have given an interesting twist. What about nuclear power? In the real world, Chernobyl scared everyone so much that countries began to curtail their nuclear ambitions. This is not the case in our history. Nuclear power plants remain a symbol of progress, not horror. Just imagine, Ukraine becomes the nuclear hub of Eastern Europe, exporting electricity to Poland, Hungary, and even the West. In the 1990s, when the real world was afraid of a repeat of the disaster, new reactors were built here. Safer ones, of course, because the lesson of the near explosion had been learned. Western investors who in reality avoided the USSR like the plague are now interested. Oh, these guys know how to keep reactors under control. Ironically, Chernobyl could have been an example of success, not failure. Perhaps we would all be warming ourselves with nuclear batteries instead of arguing about gas prices. Now let's talk about people and culture. Pripyat is not becoming a ghost town. Just imagine. Children go to school, moms buy milk in local stores, and fathers argue about whose Jiguli is cooler. Without the evacuation, there would be no trauma for hundreds of thousands of people. No liquidators who gave their health to save them. But there is a nuance. Without Chornobyl, we would not have the cultural imprint it left. No songs about the herbs of Chernobyl, no movies about the zone. Maybe instead we would have made comedies about engineers who always have time to drink coffee before a reactor test. The irony is that we could lose part of our post-apocalyptic identity, but we would live more peacefully instead. And what about the world? Without Chernobyl, the West might have perceived the USSR as a serious competitor for longer. The Cold War might have dragged on because the Soviet Union would not have looked so weak. In the United States, Reagan would probably be biting his elbows. How did they not explode? We had already prepared a script for the speech. And the environmental movement, which gained momentum after Chernobyl, would have been weaker. No mass protests against nuclear power plants. But nuclear energy could have become green earlier than solar panels. Imagine, in 2025, we all drive nuclear cars, and Greta Thunberg is in favor of more reactors, not against them. It's ridiculous but plausible. Of course, everything is not so rosy. Without Chernobyl, the USSR could have concealed its problems longer, which would have meant slower reforms. Ukraine might have gained independence later, and Kiev might not have been as open to the West. But economically, we could have won. More factories, more exports, less of the bad 90s. The irony is that the catastrophe that broke us also shaped us. And without it, we would have been different. Calmer, but perhaps less hardened. Now let's look at technology in everyday life. Without Chernobyl, nuclear power could not only flourish, but also penetrate our homes deeper than we realize. Imagine that in the 1990s, instead of gas stoves, every Soviet apartment had a mini reactor for heating borscht. Safe, of course, and with a sign that read, "Made in Chornobyl." The engineers joke, if it didn't explode in '86, then the kettle won't explode either. Of course, this is a bit of an exaggeration, but the truth is that without the disaster, we could have switched to nuclear technology faster in everything from transportation to heating. In the real world, we were afraid of reactors, but here we might have been as proud of them as Americans are of their Fords. The irony is that instead of saying Chernobyl is scary, we would say Chernobyl is cool, while drinking tea to the hum of a nuclear generator in the basement. And what about global politics? Without Chernobyl, the Soviet Union would not have lost the image of a technological giant that it had so carefully built. Imagine, in the 1990s, the USSR not only survived, but actively promoted its nuclear power plants for export to Africa, Asia, and even Latin America. The West is biting its nails because their companies like Westinghouse are losing out to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Gorbachev, instead of explaining to the world why the reactor exploded, boasts at summits, "Our nuclear power plants are the future, comrades." It's funny, but without the disaster, the USSR could have maintained its position as a superpower longer, and Ukraine would have become its nuclear heart. Of course, sooner or later, the system would have faltered anyway. But this nuclear renaissance would have given us a few extra years of stability and perhaps a few more Zhiguli on the road. So let's summarize our alternative world without the Chernobyl disaster. The Soviet Union is holding on longer, Gorbachev is probably still lecturing somewhere about perestroika, and Ukraine is becoming the nuclear star of Europe. Pripyat is a living city with cafes and Zhiguli on the roads, and we all bask in the warmth of nuclear power and joke that the engineers from Chornobyl are the best in the world because they know how not to press the wrong button. Nuclear energy rules the roost, environmentalists sing its praises, and the Cold War drags on like a badly rated TV show. Ironically, without the explosion, we could live in a more comfortable world, but without the dramatic scar that made us who we are. This story makes us think, what if one small change really rewrote everything? The real-life Chernobyl showed how fragile our world is. One mistake, and everything goes to hell. And in our fantasy, we see how easily we could have gone the other way, without panic, without an exclusion zone, but perhaps with a slightly more boring life. Imagine, no jokes about radioactive bores, but more faith in progress. It's funny, but in this world, we could still wear Soviet ties and listen to Vremya instead of News 24. And who knows, maybe we would live a little happier, or just not know what we've lost. So what do you think? Did you enjoy thinking about how history would have turned out without Chernobyl? If so, please like this article. It's our little reactor test that will definitely not explode. Also subscribe, because there are a lot more what-ifs ahead, from funny to serious. Let's figure out together how one detail can change everything and joke about what we've experienced. See you in the next story. Keep your coffee ready in case it saves the world again.